Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of Daily Co's The Brief. It's our weekly show about politics. I'm Markos and I am here with Kerry Eleveld, and today we are going to be joined by Phillips OBrien. We're going to be talking about Ukraine. We're going to be talking about how weird the partisan dynamics have become in this war, with Democrats and liberals being very strong pro-Ukraine, pro-Pentagon spending and arms shipments, and how the American right, the conservative MAGA movement, has become isolationist, non-interventionist. And so I couldn't think of anybody better to talk about this than Phillips OBrien. He is a professor of strategic studies at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, right?
Yeah.
And he is the author of How the War Was Won, which was about World War II, and Second Most Powerful Man in the World, which was about FDR's chief of staff during World War II. He knows his American war history. You can find him on Twitter at Phillips P OBrien, and you can find him on Substack at phillipspobrien.substack.com. So Phillips, welcome. Thank you for joining us all the way from Scotland.
Thank you, Marcus.
So I'm going to just lay a little foundation so people know where I'm coming from. Daily Kos was founded in 2002 in the run-up to the war in Iraq, and it really took off because it was a platform for anti-war activism during that era. And it was tough to be a liberal and an opponent of that war. You were accused of being un-American, unpatriotic. It was a very sort of McCarthyist time where there was a lot of tamping down of anti-war sentiment. And I kind of got away with it because I was a veteran. I served in the U.S. Army for several years. I was MLRS Fire Direction, MLRS Rocket Artillery. Now, everybody who follows the war in Ukraine knows all about it because it's been one of the big game changers. But that's what I did when I was in the Army. And so it was hard. People still try to accuse me of being un-American, but it was a lot harder since I was a veteran. And there are not a lot of veterans in progressive politics at the time. And certainly not in media. So it was a sort of a niche. And so we built a site on anti-imperialism, anti-war, anti-big bloated Pentagon budget. So now fast forward exactly 20 years later, almost to the month, 20 years later. And Daily Kos is now a hotbed of pro-Ukrainian activism. Our Ukrainian coverage is some of our most popular and most read content on the site. People are cheering things like M1 Abrams to Ukraine, and they're begging for F-16s, and they know their HIMARS and MLRS stats now. So it's become a weird sort of twist. And then you have the Republican Party that used to be anti-Soviet, anti-Russia. And while those elements still exist in the modern Republican Party, a big subset of it, the Trump faction of the Republican Party, is actually pro-Putin, pro-Russia.
Oh, yeah.
So Phil, I thought you, with your historical perspective and your study of war and World War II and your incredible coverage of the Ukraine war today, what do you make of that?
There's so much to unpack there, Marcos. And on the one hand, in many ways, we'd say, the period where we thought of as the right being pro-war and the left being automatically anti-war, that's only actually a very short part of American history anyway. You might say that starts in the Vietnam and goes until recently. In the past, the Democrats under Roosevelt would have been far more internationalist, interventionist, one would have said, than the Republicans. And at different times in American history, the sort of different parties have taken stances. I think what we've seen here, and I know some people don't like this analogy, is a bit of the horseshoe phenomenon, that the farther left, farther right you've gone, the more pro-Putin, pro-Kremlin you've been. And I don't know quite why they've gone that. I mean, it seems to me really quite weird that they've become so pro-Putin. But then as you move away from that, more towards sort of like the liberal left, you have those who actually say this is a war that is worth fighting. Now, why I think this war in particular, when you compare it to earlier, say Vietnam, is one, the Americans aren't doing the fighting. I think that makes a big difference.
Yep, it helps.
The Ukrainians are doing this. So this is not the United States going into Iraq to try and remake Iraq, or going into Afghanistan to try and remake Afghanistan. This is the Ukrainians standing up for themselves and just saying, help us. And I think that fundamentally and morally really changes the equation in the way that we view the war, because there are no American troops on the ground there. There are not Americans going in there to try and sort this out. We can see these are the Ukrainians fighting valiantly to save themselves. I mean, I wrote a piece in the Atlantic. I actually think this is, I hope, the future of American warfare. The future of American intervention is not to be interventionist like it has been for a long time. It's you only intervene if people are willing to fight for themselves. And I think
that's a key distinction. I just want to say, I think the difference between us going in and this being, Ukrainian self-determination, it's a lot easier to line up morally and ethically behind self-determination of a nation like Ukraine, particularly against an aggressor like Russia.
Absolutely. I mean, this is an anti-imperial war. Ukraine is being invaded. There is arguably a form of genocide that is trying to be attempted against the Ukrainian people. And the Ukrainians simply want to have their country, which is internationally recognized. They're not asking for anyone else's territory. They're just asking for their land, which according to the UN, this is the land of Ukraine. And so it's the opposite, you might say, of the way we've come to look at as imperial occupations or imperial forces. This is anti-imperial. So the United States is fighting an anti-imperial war at this time. And I think that has percolated down to the political debate on quite a profound level, that people say this is a war I can support because it isn't one where the United States is trying to rule the world. It's actually one where the Ukrainians are trying to stand up for themselves.
So that moral equation is brain dead simple, and it just boggles me that anybody would take Russia's side in this. And we can get into the tankies later on, and this idea that American imperialism is the root of all global evil. But this is pretty simple, and and I agree that makes the equation for at least the American left a much simpler one. But what is going on with the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and the Donald Trumps and that pro-Putin, pro-Trump? And so we were talking right before we came on the air, we started recording that maybe there's some parallels to World War II anti-interventionism in the American right at that time.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you might say that there's Marjorie Taylor Greene or Donald Trump are very similar to Father Coughlin or Charles Lindbergh in the late 1930s or 40s. That they use very similar rhetoric. American first. That was the rhetoric that was used at the time of the isolation, which, make America great again, this kind of American exceptionalism rhetoric. I think it's a really odd thing. It's a form of populism. That populists need to have something they need to rail against. They need to find an enemy. Now, what's strange about how they've done it is in both cases, the U.S. government's the enemy. The U.S. is the problem. So in the 1930s, it was Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a bad man. He was going to get us into a war. He was a warmonger. And that's very similar to sort of what they're saying about Biden. Biden's a bad guy. Biden's trying to do all this. I mean, you actually be really interesting. You guys would probably have a window into it being in America. I'm an American, but I'm not there. What I don't understand is, are people like Tucker Carlson doing this completely because they know this is what the Trumpites want? Or are they, I mean, do they believe this? Or is this the kind of thing that what they're doing is they go, look, Trump's got this large well of support in the Republican Party, and Trump is avowedly pro-Putin. I mean, he's called him a genius. He's very close to him. And is this simply the Carlsonites trying to suck up to the Trumpites? Or
what do you think, Kerry? I have my theory.
I have a theory too. So first of all, okay. I'm going to just go out on a limb here, right? So you guys can smack this down and say, no, that's ridiculous. But I don't think everybody's interests are the same, right? So Tucker Carlson, who might actually be considering running for president. I mean, some people have him, in their presidential 2024 view. I think he's just riding the wave. I think he's just capitalizing on what's there to capitalize on. Donald Trump might be a different story. I mean, I still don't think it's unreasonable to think that Putin has something on Trump, that Trump is, Trump might, there's a lot of cases where I think there was already a MAGA parade happening and Trump just jumped in front of it.
Mm-hmm.
This is a case where he actually might have had help jumping in front of the MAGA parade on being, America first, anti-interventionist, etc. Because he, Putin's got something. I mean, I am baffled by, I'm not baffled as much by a Tucker Carlson or even a Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's a clear opportunist, right?
Yep.
I'm more baffled by some of the other Republicans who have gone along with this. Some sort of semi-mainstream Republicans who are like, yeah, I'm just going to go in this direction. That's what I really don't get. And I don't know if Markos wants to weigh in.
Yeah, I mean, I just, as a quick reminder, because it's always fun to remember that the only change that the Trump people asked for in the 2016 Republican platform was focused on punishing Ukraine. So they've been on that Russia train from the very beginning. And I don't know if it was Trump himself, but definitely the people that he surrounded himself with. And it's all these like mafioso, mobby, unsavory types that would still lend him money when everybody else credible stopped giving him money. But I think Tucker Carlson, obviously he's an opportunist. He wasn't this virulently right-wing before he got on the Fox News. So he's definitely riding some kind of wave, but that wave is real. And I think it's based on the subset of American right that really worships what Putin stands for, right? The racism, the white ethno-nationalism, the American Taliban sort of way of using religion as a shield to try to justify all sorts of horrible excesses, the demonization of LGBTQ community. And, they kept making jokes about how the manly Russian army was going to take out the they, them woke army of the West, right? And so they really responded. And I think, obviously the Russians learned how to speak MAGA as they sort of put their finger on the scale in 2016 on both elections. And so Putin knows the words to use. And I think he sometimes obviously uses those. He's talked about Russia being canceled. And so he speaks that MAGA language and they respond to it. And it might be as simple as Putin wanted Trump to win, and that's good enough for them. So that's my theory.
They certainly are aware with it. The reaction to the midterm elections was quite depressed in Russia, among the Russian media. So
that was
they
delicious.
Certainly are. Yeah, they certainly are. I mean, I wonder to what degree it is just simply Trump's hold on a significant part of the Republican Party, and they just seem to go down his rabbit hole. And how he's been able to tap that and move it is very Father Coughlin-like, perhaps even more powerful than Father Coughlin, because they seem to be sticking with Trump through thick and thin. It's really sort of, it does have these roots in American history. Thankfully, it hasn't triumphed in American history, and we can hope it doesn't triumph now.
So, Phil, you're from my vantage point, it looks like at the United Kingdom, it's reversed, that it's the conservatives that are stalwart supporters of Ukraine. And then you have the left, or maybe it's just Jeremy Corbyn, and he sort of skews my whole view of what's happening with the British left. What's your take from home soil for you right now?
Oh, it's actually, there's elements of left and right that also back Putin. I mean, you'll have people like the column, what's his name, Hitchens, Christopher Hitchens' brother, who's a real hardcore conservative, who's really backing Putin and calling for negotiations. Nigel Farage, the great Brexiteer, and far right been backing Putin and been talking about that. Dominic Cummings, the architect of Vote Leave, is a big backer of Putin and has been calling for concessions to Russia throughout this entire thing. It might be that it's a question of who's also in power, and because the conservatives are in power and the conservative government under Johnson decided to back Ukraine, that's meant that much of the conservatives have, who might have gone the other way or have stuck have stuck with the government. And maybe it also, by the way, that has meant that some people on the far left in America have stuck with Biden who might not. If it was a Republican president backing,
of course,
backing Ukraine, there might have actually been that. So, but if you look at the Labor Party, that outside of the Corbynites, that actually it's been very strong backing of Ukraine.
Okay.
And even, this is the SNP, which probably doesn't get a lot of coverage there, Scottish National Party, has been strongly backing Ukraine. And in many ways, they're to the left of the Labor Party in certain ways, when it comes to nuclear weapons. So yes, there are the Corbynites that absolutely have gone down that way. But, I think it's very similar to the America, just different because of who is in power, I would say. But certainly a lot of the Brexiteers are like the Trumpites, and they have been definitely on the anti-Ukrainian side from the start of this.
So the Russians have obviously invested a great deal of effort in supporting these sort of pro-Russia, pro-Putin movements, like Trump and Le Pen in France, and Linke in Germany, the left,
and the AfD, both left and right in Germany.
Both left and right, and we keep coming back to that horseshoe, right? I mean, it's Code Pink and white supremacists all holding hands for Putin. Do you think they're getting their money's worth? Do you think this is actually working out for Putin in the end?
That's a really great question. They were getting their money's worth till the war started. And then when the war, this is one of those things. I've been bad on Putin. In my analysis, I've been pretty good on the war. But I've been bad on Putin because he seems to me to be doing so many stupid things, and I always think he won't continue doing stupid things. But the number one stupid decision he made was to start this war, start the full-scale invasion, because the war had been going on, as you know. The stupidest thing he had done was to start this war in February, because then he lost control. The whole thing about a war is once you go, you can maintain control if you have a crisis, if you're having threatening, if you're on the border and say we are going to invade, you can always control that. You could stop it. You could then negotiate. But once you go to war, you lose that ability because you can't control what's going to happen in a war. The other side has a real chance. They're going to fight back. And that's when Putin really lost his ability to maneuver, because he really believed his own BS about how good the Russian army was and how easy it would be to conquer Ukraine. But from that point on, I don't think he has gotten his money's worth, because basically his army has so badly underperformed that all the Putinites who would have been there to back him, all the far right, the Trumpites who would have been saying, they seem to be ineffective because the Ukrainians are actually making a mockery of their argument. Go back and watch Tucker Carlson, or watch the Brexiteers in late February and early March. They're saying, "Oh, Russia's strong. Russia's going to get its act together. They're going to win this war. We've got to force the Ukrainians to back down." That was the regular. We've got to make. In many ways, they were. Was it the comparison to Hungary in '56? Basically, hand Ukraine over to Russia. But all of a sudden, when the Russian army begins to falter and the Ukrainians all of a sudden fight really well, then those arguments sort of seem pretty pointless, because it's not poor little Ukraine against big, mighty Russia. It's large, incompetent, corrupt Russia with a really problematic military against a committed Ukraine that's going to fight really hard for its existence. And that's when their arguments collapse. And this is, sorry, I don't want to take all the time, but I think one thing that's really interesting about this is it proves one of the important points about how U.S. public opinion reacts to war. There have been a lot of really bad takes in this war. One of the really bad takes early was, the U.S. opinion's going to get bored, or they're going to get they're going to lose interest. Remember that? Or, they're going to move on to that and they'll abandon Ukraine.
It wasn't unreasonable. It was not an unreasonable.
But there's no evidence for this in U.S. history. U.S. population reacts to war primarily about victory or not. Now, maybe that's a little cynical, but i.e., what the U.S. population, they will back a war if they think it's winnable. If they don't think it's winnable, they're going to pull the plug.
Mm.
So what Ukraine did is it convinced the American people they can win. The Ukrainians can, and that all of a sudden destroys the argument of the American people who are going to say, oh, let's just abandon Ukraine. They're not going to win, force them. As soon as the Ukrainians actually started to convince the American people they can win the war, that has cemented American support for it. And it's remained really rock solid beyond the Trumpites and the Republican Party. The only part of the American population that's wavered is an element of the Republican Party, the Trumpite. So I think that's when I would say that's been the really key difference is the Ukrainians fought so well, they convinced the American population they could win. And then that has kept the support going. And at that point, it doesn't matter what Putin's spending his money on because his army can't actually change that narrative.
That's sort of a good segue into something I've been wondering about. You said earlier that your analysis about Putin hasn't been great, but your analysis about the war has been decent. And we're also talking about, Americans sticking with it because they think Ukraine can win. We seem to be entering a sort of critical phase right now. And I haven't been following this nearly as closely, of course, as or knowledgeably as Markos, who's been writing about it, who's a veteran. I'm not a veteran, who actually has experience in logistics and all that stuff. But I do have a sense that we're at a critical period, and I think a lot of people out there do. And my really basic analysis is, it seems like the conventional wisdom is now that Ukraine might not be able to keep this up forever, but Putin probably is more than willing to keep feeding Russians and mercenaries into the wood chipper in order to win this in perpetuity. So there does seem some urgency in the next coming phase of the war. I don't know if that's actually an accurate analysis of next coming phase, but I wish maybe you would either one or both of you would talk just a little bit about what's at stake in how things are changing in the landscape.
Markos, do you want to start with that, and then?
Sure, I can start. Although Phil is very capable of doing this as well, but. The current phase is both sides. Russia, it's funny. At the beginning of the war, Russia had a lot of armor. They didn't have enough forces. They invaded with a pittance of troops, and they attacked across 4 major axes in the north and the northeast, east, and south of the country. They were spread incredibly thin, and it eventually led them to have to abandon systematically 3 of those axes, and now we're fighting just on the east. But what that does mean is that you got, several 100,000 potential Russian soldiers crammed into a smaller plot of land. They've dug themselves in. They're not moving forward very much. And the places that they're more moving forward is a place called Bakhmut. And it's a wood chipper. I mean, it's just thousands are dying, Russians, but also Ukrainians, to move the front line by meters a day. It's World War I style attritional warfare. So Ukraine has been saying this is sort of the status quo. We can push in some places, but Russians are dug in. We need heavy armor. We need more artillery. We need infantry fighting vehicles to move our infantry and to protect them. And as of last week, the West opened up the floodgates on armored vehicles, and I believe over 1,000 were pledged just last Friday alone. And the U.S. has a way of, once the door opens, they just keep every month. They just add to the total. So that number is going to grow. And today, we're recording this on Tuesday. Today, Germany said that they would actually allow the export of Leopard tanks. They're going to actually chip in as well. And the United States also announced, probably at the urging of Germany, that they would give M2A1 Abrams tanks, which are probably the best battle tanks in the world. Logistically, very difficult to use, maintain, so they may take a while to show up and be used effectively. But the Leopards are going to be a big deal. So Ukraine is getting the pieces it says it needs to punch through those Russian lines. The issue is going to take a few months. I mean, doesn't happen instantaneously. So we're looking at 2-3 months before we can expect any kind of offensive. And then it's going to be raining, Phil. when it
Yep.
rains in Ukraine, everything bogs down because Captain Mud takes over. This is going back to World War II and probably the Napoleon era and beyond. Russia and that region during rainy season it's a bog. So that's my overview. Phil, what would you say differently or add to that?
Not too much differently, but I think partly we've been fooled by the U.S. military over the past 50, 60 years to think war could be quick. We think of Desert Storm or even the original seizure of Baghdad after 2001, where we think these things are over relatively soon. But actually, the U.S. is different. It has massive logistical capabilities, as Markos has experienced himself, and so the U.S. experience, and I think one of the problems, by the way, is too many people thought the Russian military was a version of the U.S. military when it's a completely different beast. What's going on here is more like a traditional state-to-state war. You have some real strong engagements, really bloody battles, and then you've got to rebuild. The Ukrainians are clearly in a rebuilding phase now. They're trying to create more offensive units. And in the meantime, they seem to say, okay, if the Russians do want to do these massed wave attacks, we'll have to just sit there and kill them. I mean, it's a horrible phase in the war. It's just, if you look at the Ukrainian claims on Russian dead, they've just skyrocketed. I think it's been 20,000 in barely a month is what they have said that the Russians, these are dead, the Ukrainians are claiming. Now, what I would say is going forward, the Ukrainians, if you see the way they've been fighting, and it's been really quite thought out, they have a way of trying to cut the supply lines into the fronts. That's been the way they've done it and the way that they've fought. And I think what they would want to do, therefore, is continue to do that, both east and west. Ideally, what they'd want to do is get close enough to the coast where they could isolate all supply going into the west area around, where the old Kherson front. There's still a lot of Russian troops there. Mm-hmm. And they can the Russians can bring them in just along the land corridor in the occupied area or through Crimea. If the Ukrainians can push forward, they don't have to push all the way down to the Black Sea. But if they can push forward 30 or so miles, then all of a sudden the ranged weapons could really shut a lot of that supply off and put the Russian forces in the west in a lot of peril. I think that would be the ideal Ukrainian plan. But as Marco said, it's really hard to go forward in this war. It's really, really hard because defensive firepower is very strong. I mean, a few guys with a handheld can ruin your day if you're in a very expensive tank. The one advance that we've seen, the Ukrainian advance at Kharkiv, happened because they hit an area where the Russians weren't. In a big advance when the Ukrainians liberated all that land south of Kharkiv, they made that advance into basically a vacuum. The Russians had been ripping all their troops out to send them to Kherson. They're not going to have that again. I don't think we're going to have this area where the Ukrainians are going to attack. So it's going to be more methodical, bloody, break a hole, go forward a bit, keep going forward, and then eventually get your ranged weapons into the point where the Russian supply system will break down. That's why everyone talks about ATACMS, because the ATACMS mean that they could start shutting off all Russian supply now.
And that is a very long-range rocket that's fired from either HIMARS or MLRS rocket artillery launchers. Right now, they have a range of about 80 kilometers, I believe. And these ATACMS would be closer to 300 and some kilometers. And so you're able to hit those Russian supply depots well behind enemy lines. That is a capability that Ukraine still doesn't have and desperately wants and would make a big difference. And I'm not sure why Biden still insists on not delivering those, but there's not that many to begin with, and that could be part of the problem, and they're not made anymore. But that's one of the frustrating things. So, Phil, we're almost out of time. So one more question is do you get any sense that the West is losing any of its resolve? There's issues with ammunition shortages, and I know that the UK and the US are scouring the world trying to find both Soviet-era ammunition for Ukraine's old stuff and the newer stuff for new stuff, and they're trying to ramp up production. But there seems to be a real shortage. Could that prevent major advancements? And those delays, could they actually, do you see any hint that the world may start, getting tired of this?
Actually, I see the opposite in Europe. And what's interesting is that, there's been a lot of focus on Berlin and the German government. What has changed in the last 2 months? You know what has happened? The Nordics, Central and Eastern European states, so this is Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, the Baltics, Poland, also, by the way, Holland,
The Dutch
and Britain have said Ukraine has to win this war. They've actually ramped up their rhetoric. They've ramped up their aid, and they are driving. Basically, the Poles put a gun to Schultz's head today. We're sending these tanks. Are you going to stop us? And Schultz backed down. So, if in many ways, one doesn't want to use Dick Cheney, but say, old Europe and New Europe here, what Cheney called New Europe back then, is actually driving a lot of this. So
yeah,
I see, in fact, what Europeans realize now is Russia can't win this war. If Russia wins this war, and I don't think they will, but if Russia wins this war, basically everything goes to pieces. Everything that they've been trying to build since 1945 collapses. So my view is Europe's in fact harder on the whole than it was 2 months ago. They really want the Russians to lose the war.
Only it took a year to get there, huh?
Yeah, Finland's prime minister, I think it was last week, literally said there is no other option but for Ukraine to win this war. And I thought, oh gosh, this is serious. They're dug in. But I appreciate the historical sweep that you're giving it. If you want to add anything to how important you think it is that Ukraine wins and Russia loses, since you're a historian, I'd love to hear it.
It's important for everybody that Ukraine, if Russia for somehow wins this war and Putin's hold on power is gripped and it looks like the Russian strategy paid off, then basically Europe ends up remilitarizing in a really dangerous and unfriendly, a really dangerous way. You'll have huge spending. You'll have basically tripwires. It would change the complete complexion of Europe. If Putin is allowed to gain from this war and then people start making concessions to him. So I think that is, and by the way, for the United States, this can be, I'm not a U.S. major interventionist. I think this is the way it should be, help Ukraine. And then the U.S. in many ways can let Europe develop its own future, that the American ability Europe should be able to look after itself. If with Russia defeated, Europe at that point would have the force to do it. So it could be a good thing for the U.S. as well to have this kind of development. And of course, it's profoundly important for the Ukrainians that if the Ukrainians have sacrificed the way they have, and if they think that everything we've done and we're abandoned, how devastating that would be. Because they would think, it was all worthless.
Thank you so much, Phil. Phillips P OBrien, he's a professor of strategic studies at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. He is author of How the War Was Won and Second Most Powerful Man in the World. You can find him on Twitter at Phillips P OBrien and at Substack at phillipsobrien.substack.com. Phil, thanks again so much. This was incredible. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Markos. Thanks, Kerry.
All right. So that is, to me, I'm still working on this this partisan shift. And Phil made this interesting comment that other than, this period between Vietnam and now, I guess, which is a historical period of maybe 30,
50.
40, 50 years. Okay, 50 years.
Yeah, 50 years, I think so.
Yeah, that it's been the left that has been more interventionist and more apt to play the role of global savior, I guess is one way to put it. And that's fascinating, even considering that the Vietnam War, really, it was JFK and Lyndon, LBJ that really started and ramped up that involvement there. So it might even be less time than that. And I wonder if this means sort of a recalibration of the left's sort of attitudes towards the Pentagon and defense spending, and or if this is just a very unique moment in time, and that the facts are just so overwhelmingly in favor of the moral authority of supporting the war in Ukraine is just so overwhelming that's overriding broader trends against liberal support of military spending.
Two things, and I might only remember one of them due to lack of sleep. So the first one is, if what Phil said comes true, which is, the Western Europe, or Europe in general, I shouldn't just say Western, but Europe really becomes more empowered with just an assist from the U.S. rather than an intervention from the U.S., but more empowered to its own self-determination, to realizing that they need to come together in order to defeat an aggressor like Russia, because otherwise the entire landscape is going to be changed, and all of their right to self-determination will be threatened. If that really comes true, it's going to become a lot easier for the political left in the United States to get behind, the United States more as an assist. You know what I mean? Like, we're an assist to helping people continue the right to self-determination. That's just a much more, I think, morally easy thing to get behind and to back, and to see how our power, our military might can actually go to good use without us, intervening just on America's behalf, right? So
oil companies or neocon dreams or any of the wrong reasons that we've wasted men and women and material in the last several decades. Yeah.
So the second thing, which I kind of remember, is
you remembered. I had forgotten there was a number two.
Yeah, but so it has to do with Biden and how well he's handled this. And I listen to all these different podcasts all the time. I was listening to a Republican commentator, and I can't remember exactly who they were, but they've worked in Republican circles for a long time. They were a not crazy commentator, because I don't listen to the crazy ones. This is a fairly reality based person, probably in conversation with like Bill Kristol or something, right? And they were saying, in terms of what Biden has accomplished on foreign policy, they, as a Republican, were thrilled, because he had managed to do more from a foreign policy standpoint than really any Republican in, certainly since Reagan, or maybe longer, to unify, Europe and behind, pro-democracy forces, and to reinvigorate NATO. And I think it was James Carville, who, of course, is not a Republican commentator, is a very, is a longtime Democrat, who sometimes I agree with and sometimes I disagree with. But he said, what an amazing feat. The way that he has managed to unite these pro-democracy forces and reinvigorate NATO without losing a single American life in the process is unbelievably successful and unmatched by really any Republican, certainly for 50 years or more. So, that is I think it's a foreign policy feat that Americans haven't fully realized yet, and might not fully realize until hopefully Ukraine finally at some point wins this, or just pushes, Russia to eventually back off. Yeah. When right?
When Ukraine wins.
Right. When Ukraine wins. And then it becomes clear what in a sort of amazing period this was in terms of American foreign policy. I'm not sure Americans will fully appreciate it. They tend to pay more attention when American lives are being lost. But this is really, even by conservative standards, and I don't mean right-wing standards like Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene, but by conservative standards, traditional conservative standards, a real incredible piece of foreign policy work for President Biden.
Yeah, I mean, Mitch McConnell hasn't criticized him on it if you just
Yeah.
want. In fact, he's been pretty laudatory about that. And it's a whole different show. There's a whole shift happening in Europe towards the Central European powers are being aggressive, while the traditional Western European powers, France and Germany, have sort of dragged their feet, and they come along reluctantly. And for a continent that really needs leadership, there's a huge void that has been left, and some are looking to Poland, but Poland's government, as good as they've been on Ukraine, has sort of autocratic tendencies, or some undemocratic, anti-press type of things that are a little disturbing. So there's no clear leader right now, and Germany is sort of doesn't want it, and a lot of it is because history. Right? You know, they're like, every time we take leadership, people accuse us of being Nazis, so we're not going to do it. And that's frustrating in times like this, but Germany just, does not want to relive that.
Well,
France does everything for France.
Can I just say,
yeah,
it's Germany isn't just afraid of how it's perceived. I mean, there's actual guilt over the role it played.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I spent like a couple months in Germany, in Berlin at one point, 10 years ago, working on working on a piece, basically a documentary. And it was, I think so many Americans just remember the power and the might of World War II in Germany and how sort of ruthless Hitler was. They haven't internalized what happened in the next coming generations of the German people, where they wanted to be supporters of peace. They never wanted to be an aggressor again. They never wanted to be not just viewed that way, but see themselves. There's just incredible amount of guilt among the Germanic people about what happened and what role they had taken in World War II, especially and obviously in terms of the Holocaust. And so people just remember the Americans kind of with the short-sighted lens and knowing a few, hot button points of history, like still see, I think Germany as this incredible power. You don't, because you've been tuned into this for a long time. But
I lived in Germany for years. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I just don't think most Americans understand how much Germans internalized, this sort of peaceful mentality, and they purposely demilitarized and left their fate in the hands of the United States because they didn't want to have the power to do anything bad.
Yeah. So all these are now coming to a head. So you're seeing that Japan was in the same boat, and Japan now is starting to finally militarize in the face of a very aggressive China. So this war is dramatically reshaping just the strategic posture of the entire country. It's going to be great business for the defense companies for the next decade or two, which makes me hurt a little bit because I'd rather that money be spent on, feeding children. But that said, Russia's just teaching us that the world maybe is a little not ideal as we wish it was. And maybe, unfortunately, we have to spend this kind of money. Now, I'm going to argue that the Pentagon budget is way over bloated and that we don't need a $800 billion Pentagon budget. But that said, this reflexively anti-Pentagon, anti-military spending posture from the left really seems to be, I think people are starting to realize why maybe this matters in a way that frankly surprises me. So this shift it's not just global strategic posturing, but it's also, I think, ideologically it's doing something. And so it's something I definitely want to keep exploring in the next months and years, because something interesting is taking place, and ideologically. And I think it's going to have consequences for budgets and elections for years to come. So I'm glad we had Phil on. He was excellent, and to really give us a bit of that historical perspective. He was fantastic. So, Kerry, that's our show. Thank you so very much. Thanks to Walter for producing. Thanks to Paul and Dorothy and everybody and Kara that make things happen behind the scenes. And thank you, our viewer and listener, for joining us. Appreciate you, love you, and look forward to visiting with you next week. Thank you so much.
And read Markos and Mark Sumner on Ukraine at our site, dailycoast.com, because they have, bar none, done the best coverage in the US really about, about this in terms of, I mean, it's been fantastic.
Thank you, Kerry. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.